The September of Baelor had been built to accommodate the faithful, not the spectacle of a great lord's humiliation. Its marble columns rose in columns of pale gold, toward a vaulted ceiling painted, with the seven's faces. And on the morning that Eddard Stark was marched before 10,000 witnesses, every face in that crowd, merchants, beggars, servants, guardsmen, wore the same expression, the quiet, practiced look of people watching something inevitable. Executions in this city were not uncommon. The execution of a warden of the North, a former hand of the king, that was theater of a different order. The crowd had not come to mourn. They had come to see the great machine of Lannister. Power grind another honorable man to paste. Cersei Lannister stood in the shade of the September's eastern gallery, her gown the color of dried blood, her expression arranged into something between boredom and satisfaction. Joffrey sat the ceremonial chair beside her, vibrating with barely contained excitement, his fingers tapping on the armrests. Tyrion was conspicuously absent. He had made his excuses, citing business with the gold cloaks. And Cersei had not pushed the matter. She had her son, she had the crowd, and she had the broken Lord Stark kneeling on the stones below, about to give a false confession before the seven and all of King's Landing. The High Septon was already clearing his throat. Then Ned Stark raised his head. It was such a small motion, a man who had been staring at the flagstones, simply lifting his face to the sky. But something in the quality of that stillness stopped the High Septon mid-breath. The crowd's murmur softened. Even Joffrey's fingers went still. Sansa, standing under guard 20 feet away, pressed her hands together so hard her knuckles went white. And she did not know why, only that something in her father's face had changed. The defeated slump of his shoulders was gone. Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell looked, for the first time in weeks, like a man who had made a decision. He did not shout. He did not need to. When Ned Stark spoke in the September of Baelor, every ear in that vast marble space caught the words as cleanly as if he had whispered them into each listener's personal hearing. I invoke the right of trial by combat. 7 words. The High Septon blinked. A guardsman near the gallery shifted his grip on his spear without knowing why. Cersei's carefully constructed expression did not change, but the color left her. Faced with the speed of water through sand, and where satisfaction had been, there was now something she was working very hard not to call fear. The crowd erupted. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. Ancient law in Westeros is not a principle. It is a weapon, and every lord, every maester, every schemer with a cup of wine in his hand, and a scheme in his pocket knows this with the intimacy of long practice. Trial by combat had been part of the faith's legal tradition since, before the Undulls crossed the narrow sea, the notion that the gods would guide the arm of the righteous, that a man who invoked this right, and one had been judged, innocent by powers beyond any king's authority to contradict. It had been used rarely in living memory. It required both parties to accept, or for the accusing authority to name a champion. And the accused had the same right. Cersei knew the law. She had spent her life mastering every rule that might someday constrain her, precisely so that she could find the angles around them. What she had not calculated, could not have calculated, because it required Ned Stark to choose his own life over his children's safety, which she had judged impossible, was this particular invocation, at this particular moment, in front of 10,000 witnesses, and a High Septon who had the inconvenient habit of taking his ceremonial duties seriously. She could not simply refuse, denying a man his ancient right in the September of Baelor, before the Seven's own painted faces, before a crowd of 10,000 small folk, who already whispered about the manner of Robert's death. That would not be a political problem. It would be a theological catastrophe. The High Sparrows movement had not yet consolidated its power, but the seeds were there. In every gutter and every back alley of Flea Bottom, the faith's hungry fringe, waiting for the moment when the crown overreached. If Cersei denied Ned Stark his right in the most sacred space in King's Landing, she would hand those seeds a season's reign. She leaned to Joffrey and whispered 2 words. Her son, to his credit, and it surprised her, did not argue. The High Septon cleared his throat again, this time with the particular resonance of a man who understood. That history was watching him. The accused has invoked his ancient right, he announced, his voice carrying through the September's vaulted silence. This court will honor the tradition of the Seven. Lord Stark will name his champion, and the crown will name its own. The trial will be held in 3 days' time, on the ground before the Red Keep. Let the gods judge. The crowd's noise became something that was not quite chaos and not quite celebration. People pressed forward and were pushed back. Gold cloaks moved, uncertain of their orders. Sansa burst into tears that she tried immediately to suppress, because crying in front of Cersei felt like surrendering something she could not get back. Janos Slynt, standing near the September's entrance, was already dispatching a rider to the Tower of the Hand. Ned Stark was helped to his feet. He was weakened, his legs still not fully healed. The dungeon's work visible in every line of his face, and when a guardsman moved to take his arm, he met the man's eyes with a look that made the guardsman step back. Lord Stark did not need help standing. What Lord Stark needed was a sword arm, and he had 3 days to find one willing to stand against the mountain. On the eastern gallery, Cersei had already begun calculating. She was very good at calculating. She turned to the man standing quietly at her shoulder, the man who was always, somehow, exactly where he needed to be to hear the most dangerous things. Littlefinger, she said softly. Peter Baelish smiled the smile of a man who had not been surprised in 15 years. The mountain will make short work of anyone Lord Stark can find in this city, he said. The city who would fight for him are either dead, sworn to other lords, or wise enough to know that Lannister debts are paid in blood. Anyone he can find, Cersei repeated. Almost anyone. Littlefinger's eyes moved toward the September's shadowed archways, where the departing crowd surged and jostled. There is, I'm told, one name he might consider, though I suspect you already know which name I mean. Cersei's eyes followed his. Somewhere in the dispersing crowd, a very large man in a plain gray cloak was moving against the flow of foot traffic, moving toward the place where Ned Stark was being escorted under guard, moving with the particular unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to rush. Sandor Clegane did not look at his queen. He never did, anymore. The small council chamber smelled of tallow candles and Lannister anxiety, which Tyrion Lannister had always found to be a particularly pungent combination. He sat in his customary chair, too tall for him, as all chairs in King's Landing were too tall for him. With a cup of arbor gold he was not drinking, watching his sister pace the length of the room in a way that he recognized as her thinking walk. Cersei only paced when the variables had exceeded her ability to hold them still in her head. It was, in its way, a comforting sight. It meant she had not yet arrived at a solution. Varys sat opposite Tyrion, his hands folded in his lap with the serenity of a man who meditated regularly and ate well. Grand Maester Pycelle was examining the grain of the table with the focused attention of a man who desperately wished he were elsewhere. The chair that should have held Littlefinger was empty. He had sent his regrets and a vague note about a pressing matter in the city's financial district, which meant he was somewhere, gathering information and would appear when the information was worth selling. He has no champion, Cersei said, for what Tyrion calculated was the 3rd time in as many minutes. Every knight in this city is ours or terrified of us. The Stark household guard is dead or imprisoned. He has no one. He has 3 days, Tyrion said. 3 days to find a man willing to stand against Gregor Clegane. She stopped pacing and looked at her brother with the particular expression she reserved for him, something between contempt and involuntary respect. Name one knight in King's Landing who would climb into that yard against the mountain for Eddard Stark's sake. Tyrion turned his wine cup slowly. I can think of one man who might not be doing it for Stark's sake. The silence that followed had texture to it. Pycelle's examination of the table grain intensified. Sandor Clegane, Varys said, in the tone of a man confirming what everyone in the room was already thinking, has not left King's Landing. He was observed this morning near the holdfast where Lord Stark is being kept. A pause, precisely timed. He was also observed speaking briefly with Lord Stark himself, through a door. Briefly, but speaking nonetheless. Cersei's pacing resumed, faster now. Sandor is sworn to Joffrey. Sandor is sworn to the crown. Tyrion said. And Joffrey is the crown. But sworn swords are men, not furniture. They have opinions. They have histories. He let that sit for a moment. He has a history, specifically, with a very large man who currently serves as the crown's champion. I will not have my son's sworn shield. You may not have a choice, Tyrion said, and there was nothing gentle in how he said it. If Sandor chooses to offer himself as champion, the law is clear. The accused has the right to any able-bodied man willing to stand for him. Sandor is a free man to the extent any sworn sword is free. You would have to forbid him explicitly, in public, before the High Septon, and then explain to 10,000 witnesses why the crown is afraid of its own proceedings. The candles guttered. Outside, a raven launched from the Tower of the Hand with a sound like a brief argument, and then the night was quiet again. The mountain will kill him, Cersei said. It was not said with satisfaction. It was said carefully, as if she were testing the weight of the words. Perhaps, Varys said. Ser Gregor is certainly the larger man, and the stronger. Physically, yes. Varys unfolded his hands and refolded them the other way, a gesture that in Varys signified that he was about to say something that would be uncomfortable for everyone present. Though I am told, by little birds with good ears, that Sandor Clegane has beaten his brother before, in private, without witnesses. Once, years ago, in the yard at Clegane's keep, when Gregor was 16 and had not yet grown fully into what he became. Pause as fine as thread. He has never spoken of it, but he has never forgotten it either. Men with faces like his do not forget the fire that made them. The chamber absorbed this. Grand Maester Pycelle made a sound that was not quite a cough. What does Stark want? Tyrion asked. What does any man want who invokes this right? Varys replied. To live. To see his daughters safe. Possibly to return to the north and never trouble King's Landing again. He looked at Tyrion with those pale, unreadable eyes. He has not asked for the throne. He has not declared a claimant. He has done the single thing a clever man in his position could do. He has forced the law to protect him, which is something the law in this city rarely troubles itself to do. Clever men get killed in this city, Cersei said. Yes, Tyrion agreed. And stupid ones get bored and start wars. I am not sure which outcome I find more exhausting. He set down his wine. The question before us, sister, is not whether the mountain can beat Sandor Clegane. The question is what happens to us if he does, and what happens if he doesn't. Two very different answers, and neither one is comfortable. Cersei stopped pacing. She stood at the window that overlooked the city's torchlit rooftops, the bay dark beyond them, and her reflection in the glass was something that Tyrion, looking at it, thought resembled their father more than she would ever have wanted to know. Tywin Lannister had worn that same expression when he was working through a problem that had more threads than hands, the cold focus of a woman who did not believe in unsolvable problems, only in solutions that required more ruthlessness than others were willing to deploy. Send word to Clegane's keep, she said. Tell Ser Gregor that the crown expects his full commitment to this matter. She paused. And tell him who may be standing opposite him. Tyrion raised an eyebrow. You think that changes Gregor's approach? I think it improves it. Her reflection in the glass smiled thinly. Gregor has always been thorough, but thoroughness with an audience that includes his brother might motivate a particular quality of effort. Tyrion said nothing to this. He thought of Sandor, Clegane's face, one half of it sculpted by fire into something that was less wound and more a permanent record, and the way the man moved through Joffrey's court, silent, contemptuous, there and not there simultaneously. He had spent years watching the Hound protect a boy he despised for a crown he didn't care about, in a city he actively loathed. He had watched Sandor Clegane watch his brother from across rooms at tournaments, with the stillness of a man who has been waiting so long for something that he is no longer certain. He wants it to arrive. And now Ned Stark had put a door between them with a question on the other side of it. Tyrion very much wanted to know what had been said through that door. One more matter, Varys said, as the meeting dissolved and Pycelle began the laborious process of rising from his chair. Robb Stark's army. Cersei turned from the window. The young wolf has been informed, Varys said, his voice carrying the particular, delicate weight of a man delivering news he knows will change the shape of everything. A raven went north. Before we could prevent it, we believe from a Stark bannerman within the castle. Lord Robb knows his father is alive and has invoked trial by combat. Varys smoothed the front of his robe with one soft hand. He has halted his march south. Halted, Cersei repeated. He is waiting, Varys said, to see what the gods decide. The candles guttered again in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows on the walls moved like the banners of houses that had not yet chosen sides. The cell they kept. Ned Starkin was better than the black cells, but worse than honest imprisonment, which was to say it occupied that particular Lannister gradient between cruelty and pragmatism. There was a cot. There was a window slit that admitted a finger of gray morning light. There was a guard who changed every 4 hours and never spoke. Ned had spent his time in it doing the things he had always done when the world pressed in. He had thought carefully, moved little, and waited for clarity. Clarity had come in the form of a question. He had asked himself in the September's marble hush, kneeling on stones that had been polished smooth by generations of the faithful. What would Robb do if I confess and take the black? He had known the answer before the question finished forming. Robb would not accept it. Robb had his mother's pride and his father's honor in equal measure, which was a combination that produced a young man, constitutionally incapable of watching his father kneel to Lannisters. He would march anyway. He would march with righteous fury and no political margin, and he would be destroyed by it, because Tywin Lannister was not a man who let righteous fury survive long enough to become a problem. Ned had seen what happened to righteous fury at the Trident, at the sack of King's Landing, at 100 smaller moments where good men had met the Lannister machine and been processed through it. A false confession would not save his son. It would only give the Lannisters a head start. So he had said the 7 words. And now he sat in his cell in the gray morning light and waited for the door. When it opened, it was not the guard he expected. Sandor. Clegane filled the doorframe the way large men filled doorframes in small spaces. Not threateningly, precisely, but with the absolute physical fact of his presence, which precluded the possibility of ignoring him. He wore no livery. Plain leather, a dark cloak, the sword at his hip that was always at his hip, because Sandor Clegane and that sword had an arrangement that predated his oath too, the crown by several years. He looked at Ned Stark with the expression he used for everything, the look of a man who has decided that the world is exactly as bad as he always suspected and has chosen to be neither surprised nor especially troubled by this. You're going to lose, Sandor said. It was not a greeting. It was an assessment. Probably, Ned agreed. He had always appreciated directness. It was a quality that King's Landing punished so consistently that encountering it here felt like cold water. Unless someone stands for me. Everyone in this city with a sword and half a spine is either Lannister sworn or smart enough to know what happens to people who inconvenience Lannister interests. Sandor moved into the cell without being invited. There was nowhere to sit except the cot, and he didn't sit, just stood with his back against the far wall and his arms crossed. His burned cheek turned slightly, away from the windows. Thin light with the unconscious habit of decades. You've got no one. I have whoever's standing in this cell. Sandor was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a cart rattled over cobblestones, and somewhere in the castle above, the day's business was beginning its noise. I'm sworn to Joffrey, he said. You're sworn to the crown. Joffrey wears the crown. There's a difference, and you've always known there's a difference, or you would have left this city years ago. Ned watched him with the patience of a man who had spent a long time reading people through necessity rather than inclination. I'm not asking you to betray your oath. I'm asking you to stand in a yard before the 7 and let the gods render their judgment. If your oath is to the crown's legitimacy, then the crown's legitimacy includes this law. Pretty reasoning, Sandor said. Tywin Lannister has prettier reasoning, and he's killed more men with it than the sword. I'm not Tywin Lannister. No. A pause. You're the man who trusted the wrong people in the wrong city and ended up on his knees in a September. No offense. None taken. It's accurate. Ned folded his hands. The morning light moved across the floor between them. I can't offer you land. I can't offer you gold. Whatever the Lannisters haven't taken from me is sitting in Winterfell, under my son's control. I can't offer you safety, because if you do this and lose, they'll find a reason to make your life difficult regardless of your oath. I can't even offer you certainty, because no man alive knows what the gods want. He met Sandor's eyes, the one fully visible and the one half-lidded by old scar tissue with the directness that had made him a poor politician and a respected lord. What I can offer you is the fight. Something shifted in Sandor Clegane's expression. Not much. The man had spent years training his face to give away nothing but enough. A tightening around the jaw. A quality of attention that had not been there 30 seconds ago. The fight, he repeated. You've been in this city for years watching your brother collect rewards for being what he is. You've watched him in the tournament yard, watched lords praise him, watched the crown use him. Ned's voice did not rise. He was not appealing to emotion. He was stating observable facts with the same tone he would use to discuss harvest yields. I don't know what happened between you and Gregor Clegane before you were Joffrey's sworn sword. I don't know what it cost you, but I know what it looks like when a man has unfinished business, because I've been carrying my own for 14 years. A breath. I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you whether you want to finish what was started. The silence in the cell had the quality of a held breath. The cart sounds outside continued, entirely indifferent. Sandor uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor. For a moment, a gesture that on anyone else might have seemed like uncertainty, but on him read more as a man checking his own foundations before adding weight to them. Then he looked up. 3 days, he said. 3 days, Ned confirmed. I want it understood, Sandor said, that I'm not doing this because I think you deserve it. Half the lords in this kingdom deserve things they don't get, and half the things they get they don't deserve. And the gods, if they're watching, seem perfectly content to let that arrangement continue indefinitely. Understood. And I'm not doing this for your son, or your daughters, or the North, or whatever song the bards will make of it afterward, because the bards always make it about something it isn't. Also understood. Sandor Clegane straightened from the wall. He was, when he stood at his full height, a genuinely formidable physical fact, not the mountain's impossible size, but the size of a man built for exactly this purpose, hardened by years of the kind of work that left marks. He looked at Ned Stark with something that was not warmth, and was not respect, and was not loyalty to any house or king, but was perhaps the closest thing to honesty that King's Landing had produced in recent memory. Tell no one, he said, not your daughter, not whatever Stark men you've got left in this city. I'll present myself to the High Septon on the morning of the trial. Anything before that, and the Queen will find a way to make it complicated. He moved to the door. The guard outside had evidently been persuaded to look elsewhere, because there was no challenge. Clegane, Ned said. Sandor paused without turning. For what it's worth, Ned said, I think the gods have been waiting for this one. Sandor made a sound that might, from a different man, have been a laugh. Then they've got patience to rival a Stark. He stepped through the door. That's not a compliment, Lord Stark. It's an observation. The door closed. The morning light moved another inch across the floor. In the Tower of the Hand, a raven arrived from the twins with a letter that bore Walder Frey's seal, inquiring about the Northern Army's intentions and whether certain alliances, previously discussed, might need to be revisited in light of recent developments. It sat unread on Tyrion Lannister's desk for 3 hours before he opened it, and when he did, he read it twice and then sat very still for a long moment before reaching for his wine. The morning of the trial arrived, the way bad weather arrives in King's Landing, not with the North's honest howling announcement, but sliding in under a gray sky that couldn't decide between rain and overcast, the air carrying the smell of the bay and the city's accumulated human industry. The ground before the Red Keep had been prepared, a fighting square marked with rope and stakes, torches on iron poles burning despite the daylight, the galleries filling from the 3rd hour after dawn with the kind of crowd that turns out for history, because it can smell the difference between the ordinary and the irreversible. Tyrion Lannister watched from a gallery with a cup of wine he was actually drinking, this time in the expression of a man attending an event he has correctly predicted will be terrible but could not talk. Anyone out of holding. Below him, the great lords of the city were arranged in their finery with the carefully neutral faces of people who had learned that public displays of allegiance at critical moments had a way of becoming evidence. He could see the Tyrells contingent, Loras standing, with his hand near his sword hilt in the way young knights do when they're trying to look calm and various. Lords whose names he could produce, but whose faces blurred into the general category of men with too much gold and insufficient wisdom. His father's chair was empty. Tywin Lannister had sent his regrets from Harrenhal, which meant Tywin Lannister was watching this from a distance and had chosen to be associated with neither outcome until the outcome was established. It was, Tyrion reflected, exactly what he would have done in his father's position, and he resented the admiration he felt for it. Cersei sat in the royal gallery with Joffrey on her left and her face arranged in the expression of absolute certainty that she deployed when she was least certain. Joffrey was, for once, quiet, not from wisdom, but because even he had enough animal instinct to recognize that the atmosphere in the yard below did not welcome the particular register of his usual enthusiasms. Myrcella sat beside her mother with her hands folded and her eyes very wide. The High Septon arrived in his ceremonial robes with the 7-pointed star worked in gold thread, attended by septas and a pair of silent watching men whose presence Tyrion found less holy than advertised. He took his position at the head of the square and raised his hands for the formal invocation, and the crowd's murmurs subsided the way fire subsides when the fuel runs low, not extinguished, merely waiting. Ned Stark was brought from his cell. He had been given his own clothes. That much had been honored, perhaps because denying it would have looked petty, and the Lannisters were many things, but rarely obviously petty when obvious. Pettiness could be avoided. He walked with a slight list from his leg, unhealed and probably never going to fully heal the way young men's wounds heal. And his face had the gauntness of weeks on poor food and bad air. But he walked into that yard with his head up, and when he reached his position and turned to face the gallery, he looked exactly like what he was, a warden of the North, who had made a decision and was prepared to carry it to whatever conclusion the gods saw fit. Cersei leaned toward Joffrey and murmured something. Joffrey made a gesture with 2 fingers, and a door at the far end of the yard opened. Gregor Clegane entered. There was a certain kind of silence that fell over crowds when the mountain appeared in spaces where violence was the point. It was not the silence of awe, exactly, though awe was present. It was closer to the silence of recalibration, the moment when every person in a crowd independently performs the same arithmetic and arrives at the same uncomfortable answer. Ser Gregor Clegane stood 8 feet of armored brutality in the morning's gray light, his helm under one arm, his face wearing the expression it always wore, which was the expression of a man who finds the world's offerings consistently beneath his abilities but is prepared to demonstrate this again as many times as necessary. His sword, which should not have been the size it was the size it was. He rolled his neck once with a sound like a millstone, and the crowd did its recalibration, and the yard went quiet. He looked across the fighting square toward Ned Stark. Then he looked at the door through which Ned Stark's champion would emerge. The door did not open. 1 second. 2. Tyrion counted them with the focus of a man who has learned that the spaces between events carry as much information as the events themselves. He could see Cersei's posture shifting incrementally toward satisfaction. He could see Joffrey beginning to smirk. He could see the High Septon drawing breath for the procedural declaration that would follow if no champion presented. The door opened. Sandor Clegane came through it without armor. This produced a second silence, different in character from the first. The mountain's silence had been the silence of weight and certainty. The hound's silence was the silence of something unexpected, a visual fact that required a moment to process. He wore leather and a padded gambeson, his habitual sword on his back, and he moved into the yard with the unhurried stride of a man who has made his decision and has no further use for hesitation. He was not small. He was simply not the mountain. And in this yard, on this morning, the comparison imposed itself on every watching eye with the relentlessness of mathematics. The crowd found its voice again, ragged and uncertain. Gregor Clegane had gone very still. It was not the stillness of surprise. Nothing surprised the mountain. Or if it did, his body refused to admit it. It was a different stillness. The stillness of a man encountering something he has not thought about in years, and discovering it has grown teeth in the interim. He looked at his brother with the expression of a man doing his own arithmetic and not finding the answer as comfortable as he had anticipated. Sandor took his position across the rope from Ned Stark's assigned place, rolled his sword shoulder once, and looked at Gregor with no expression that any bard would later be able to adequately describe. He did not look angry. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man arriving somewhere he had always expected to arrive, and finding the road had been shorter than advertised. Sandor Clegane presents himself as champion for the accused, the High Septon announced, with the particular cadence of a man fulfilling a legal function while privately adjusting his theology. Does the accused accept? He does, Ned Stark said from his position. The High Septon looked at the Crown's gallery. Joffrey's smirk had faded. Cersei's expression was performing. Certainty so hard. It had become its own kind of tell. She said nothing. She could not say anything. Not here. Not now. Not in front of this crowd and this High Septon, and these torches and these watching faces. She could refuse and hand Ned Stark a political weapon sharper than any Valyrian steel. Or she could nod. She nodded. Let the combat commence, the High Septon intoned. Let the gods bear witness. Tyrion drank his wine. What followed in the first exchange was not the choreographed brutality of a tournament melee, where knights perform violence, according to understood conventions, and the crowd knew when to gasp. It was immediate and ugly and specific in the way that real violence between experts is always specific, too. Men who knew exactly what the other intended before the intention fully formed, adjusting in real time. The opening exchange lasting perhaps 40 seconds and establishing a single critical fact. Sandor Clegane was faster. Not dramatically. Not by a margin that made the mathematics comfortable. Gregor's first strike, which had ended every engagement it had reached in the last decade, met a deflection that should not have been physically possible given the size differential, and the crowd's unified flinch turned into something more complicated. Gregor recovered with the ease of a man to whom setbacks are merely the preamble to greater effort. He came again with the particular, focused malice of a man who has never been genuinely tested and is now recategorizing the thing in front of him from obstacle to problem. Sandor bled from a cut above his good eye. He had been inside his brother's reach for half a second, which was half a second less than most men managed, and the price had been a nick from a gauntlet edge rather than a crushed skull, which by the Mountain's accounting was essentially a miss. He reset his stance, and in that brief pause before the second exchange, he looked across the rope at Gregor Clegane with the expression he had been working toward for 20 years. In the gallery, Cersei had stopped performing certainty. She was simply watching now, still as a painted queen, and her stillness was the most honest thing she had shown anyone in King's Landing in years. The second exchange lasted longer than the first and was worse to watch. Not worse in the sense of more blood, though there was more blood, Sandor's from 3 places and Gregor's from 1, which was itself remarkable enough that a maester in the gallery leaned forward with professional interest and nearly fell over the railing. Worse in the sense that it had the quality of 2 irresolvable forces discovering the exact shape of each other's resistance. And the crowd, which had come expecting the comfortable conclusion of an execution, repackaged as divine judgment, was now watching something that had no predetermined ending. This was not what crowds at King's Landing were built for. They shifted and murmured, and pressed against the rope, barriers with the collective unease of people whose arithmetic had stopped producing reliable answers. Gregor Clegane fought the way he always fought, which was the way a siege engine conducts a siege, with patience, with absolute confidence in the eventual outcome, and with the particular cruelty of a man who has learned that suffering precedes breaking, and has never found a reason to skip the suffering. He did not try to end it quickly. He had never had to try to end things quickly. His weight and his reach and his strength were the argument. And the argument was one he had been making for 20 years without a counterpoint. What he encountered in Sandor was not a counterpoint to his argument. It was a different argument entirely. Sandor had spent his life in his brother's proximity, which meant Sandor had spent his life studying the mountain the way a man studies the thing most likely to kill him, with total attention. Across years, from a position of enforced intimacy, he knew how Gregor moved when he was building to the killing blow. He knew the slight drop of the left shoulder that preceded the crosscut. He knew the mountains blind side on the right from a shoulder. Wound taken 15 years ago, that had never quite healed straight, though Gregor had spent 15 years pretending otherwise. He knew things about Gregor Clegane that no tournament opponent, no Kingsguard report, no Maester's assessment could have contained, because they were the specific, private knowledge of a man who had grown up in the shadow of a monster and had survived by understanding the monster's geometry. This did not mean he was winning. What it meant was that he was not losing at the expected rate, which was its own kind of statement. The third exchange came when Gregor pressed forward, with the sustained assault that had never failed, to end an engagement through sheer accumulated force, and Sandor moved laterally rather than back, a choice that cost him the cut across his left forearm but bought him the angle he needed, and for a moment, one terrible suspended moment, his sword was inside his brother's guard and everything in the yard compressed into the arithmetic of what happened next. Gregor caught the blade on his vambrace. The impact rang across the yard like a bell. Sandor was thrown back by the sheer rebounding force of striking something that was less a man than an armored geological feature, and he hit the ground with the controlled fall of someone who has fallen in practice yards since childhood and knows how to land without breaking what needs to not be broken. He was up before Gregor could follow through, barely, and with the speed of a man whose body is beginning to register the morning's accumulated costs, and the crowd made a sound that had no clean analog in ordinary human expression. In the gallery, Tyrion set down his cup. He was watching his sister more than the fight, because he had learned young that the most important thing in any room was not the obvious drama but the faces of the people controlling it. Cersei was watching the yard with an expression he had not seen on her before, not in the September of Baelor when Ned invoked his right, not in the small council chamber the night before, not in any of the 100 rooms and crises they had navigated together across decades. It was the expression of a woman who has built an entire structure on the certainty of a single load-bearing wall and has just heard that wall produce a sound it should not produce. She was afraid, not of losing the trial, precisely, though that fear was present underneath the larger one. She was afraid of what a world looked like in which Ned Stark lived, walked out of that yard, and went back to the north with his daughters and his knowledge of Joffrey's parentage. She was afraid of the specific cascade of events that followed a living Lord Stark with a legitimate grievance and a son with an army. She had planned against Ned Stark dead. She had built the next year of Lannister power on the political silence of a man who could not speak from the ground. A living Ned Stark was not merely a problem. He was an architecture of problems, every one of them attached to every other. She leaned to the man seated 2 places to her right, not Joffrey, but Ser Barristan of the Kingsguard, who wore his white cloak with the enthusiasm of a man who had agreed to the vow. Without reading the small print, she said something. Trant's eyes moved to the yard. He said something back. Cersei's expression did not change. Tyrion watched this exchange with the attention it deserved, which was total. He rose from his chair. The 5th exchange had begun below. Gregor had shifted his approach with the adaptability of a man who has been fighting long enough to know when one tactic requires revision, and he was now attempting to use reach and weight in combination with a lateral press that had the effect of reducing Sandor's movement options incrementally, the way a tide reduces beach. Sandor was bleeding more freely from the forearm now, and his breathing had the quality of a man budgeting what he had left. But he had stopped trying to match his brother's force, which was the decision that had kept him alive through the first 3 exchanges. And he was doing something Tyrion recognized from the single time he had watched him fight in earnest. He was waiting, not passively, not the waiting of a man running out of options, the waiting of a man who knows that a specific moment will come and has decided that spending himself before that moment is the only losing strategy available. Tyrion moved along the gallery toward the stairs, excusing himself past lords who were too riveted to the yard below to notice him passing. He needed to be lower. He needed to see Trant, and he needed to see the Kingsguard positions, and he needed to be somewhere that was not behind a railing if the situation below required him to do something inconvenient. The 6th exchange happened while he was on the stairs. He did not see it. He heard it. The crowd sound told him. What had occurred with the specificity of a language he had been learning since boyhood? A sharp collective intake, a single beat of silence, then noise, rising, splitting between two registers. Something that was almost cheering and something that was almost horror. The two sounds of a crowd that cannot agree on what it has just witnessed or what it should want. He reached the base of the stairs and came through the arch into the lower gallery level just as the yard resolved itself from chaos into clarity. Gregor Clegane was on one knee. He was not dead. He was not yielding. He was on one knee because his right leg had been compromised, cut behind the knee in the specific place that Sandor had been engineering towards since the third exchange, the place where even the mountain's impossible endurance could not compensate for physics. He was getting up. He would get up, the crowd and Tyrion and every person in that yard understood this with absolute certainty, because men like the mountain do not stay down. They simply add new damage to the inventory and continue. But he was on one knee, and in 20 years of watching his brother fight, Sandor Clegane had never seen him on one knee. And the expression on the Hound's face in that fraction of a moment was the expression of a man who has been waiting for something for so long that its arrival is almost incomprehensible. Tyrion looked at Trant. Trant was looking at Cersei's gallery. His hand was on his sword hilt. And Tyrion Lannister, who had been underestimated in this city for 30 years and had learned to spend that particular advantage carefully, opened his mouth and said, in a voice pitched to carry across the lower gallery, to the Kingsguard stationed at the yard's edge, Ser Marin, a word from the hand. Trant turned. Tyrion smiled the smile he used when he needed someone to believe he had authority he might not technically possess. Now, Tyrion said pleasantly, if you please. Below, Gregor Clegane finished standing up. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be argued about in King's Landing for years. The bards would eventually settle on a version. They always settled on a version, because versions were what bards sold. And the truth had too many corners for a song, and the version they settled on had the clean architecture of a story in which the gods will expressed itself through a single transcendent moment of violence, after which all ambiguity dissolved. The version Tyrion Lannister carried for the rest of his life had more corners than the bard's version, and he considered this a point in its favor. Gregor Clegane rose from his knee and came forward with the particular quality of a man, converting shame into physics. The crowd had time to register that the mountain was moving again before the next exchange began. And what the crowd saw in that exchange, what 10,000 witnesses saw, and would spend years arguing about over wine and dice and guttering candles, was Sandor Clegane doing something that should not have worked against a man of his brother's size and remaining fury. He stopped moving, not from exhaustion, though exhaustion was present, not from a wound slowing him, though the forearm was bad and the cut above his eye had closed only imperfectly. He stopped moving because he had found the thing he was looking for, which was a specific quality of ground, a specific angle of approach, a specific window in Gregor's attack, pattern that Gregor's anger had opened by, making him predictable. The mountain, in his fury at being damaged, had become the thing he never became, legible. Sandor let him come. The sword took him in the gap between Gorget and Pauldron, the join that no armorer had ever adequately solved for a man of the mountain's proportions, because a man of the mountain's proportions was not supposed to be achievable, and the armor had been scaled from human templates toward something inhuman, and the scaling had introduced this specific imperfection that Sandor had noted in the yard at Clegane's Keep when he was 9 years old, watching his brother train and cataloging weaknesses, the way a child catalogs the features of the monster that haunts him. Gregor Clegane made a sound that was not a word or a name or an acknowledgement. It was a sound that had no precedent in the crowd's collective experience of him, because it was a sound of surprise. And the mountain did not make sounds of surprise. He did not fall. Men like Gregor Clegane do not simply fall. He stepped back, once, twice, his hand going to his neck with the specific bewildered motion of a man who has spent a lifetime being the thing that damages other things and is encountering, for the first time, the other side of that arithmetic. He stayed upright through something that could charitably be called will and uncharitably called the body's refusal to accept information. The mind was presenting it. Sandor did not press the advantage. This was the part the bards found difficult. Every clean version of the story required Sandor to close and finish it, because that was what the moment's logic demanded, and that was what the crowd's held breath was waiting for. Instead, he stepped back and stood, breathing hard, and looked at his brother with an expression that would later be described as many things by many people who had been there, and which Tyrion, who had a better angle than most, would describe simply as finished, not victorious, not triumphant, the expression of a man who has completed a task that has occupied his entire life and is now standing in the strange, empty space where the task used to be, unsure what comes next. The High Septon stepped forward. His robes were entirely incongruous with the occasion, gold thread amid the smell of blood and disturbed dirt, and his voice shook slightly as he invoked the procedural language. Ser Clegane is unable to continue. The gods have rendered their judgment. A pause in which every person present understood that the next words were going to change the shape of things. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, is found innocent of all charges before this court. The yard erupted, not with the clean sound of celebration. There was that from the small folk in the cheap positions, the people who had come to see an execution and were now seeing something they did not have a framework for, but layered under it, audible to anyone listening for it, was the sound of a city's political class recalculating. Lords who had not moved from their seats all morning were suddenly in motion. Ravens would be written before the afternoon was out. Riders were already preparing. Tyrion watched Ser Trant, who had spent the last several minutes in Tyrion's company, hearing a detailed and entirely improvised account of administrative matters that required immediate Kingsguard attention. In the lower passages of the Red Keep, Trant had the expression of a man who is not certain. He has been manipulated but suspects it, and has not yet decided whether to act on the suspicion. He looked at the yard. He looked at the royal gallery. Cersei's face, visible even at distance, had closed itself completely, a door shut and bolted from the inside. Joffrey's face had not closed. Joffrey's face was open in the worst possible way, flushed and young and furious. The face of a boy who has been denied something he had considered his and cannot yet process that the denial is irrevocable. He turned to Cersei and said something with an emphatic gesture. Cersei put her hand on his arm, with the firmness of a woman preventing a catastrophe in real time. Whatever Joffrey had been about to order did not happen. In the yard, Ned Stark was being approached by the High Septon's attendants for the formal completion of the legal process. He stood with the particular stillness of a man who has survived something he was not entirely certain he would survive, and whose mind is not yet caught up to the fact of his continued existence. His eyes found Sansa across the yard. She had been brought to witness as Cersei's insurance against Ned behaving unexpectedly, and the insurance had turned inside out, and something passed between them that no bard would ever find adequate language for, because adequate language for a father and daughter looking at each other across a yard, full of noise when the outcome had been otherwise would have required a honesty that songs resist. Sandor Clegane had walked to the edge of the fighting square and stopped. He was not looking at Ned. He was not looking at Gregor, who was being attended by maesters in a manner that suggested the wound was serious and the prognosis was unclear. He was looking at nothing in particular, or rather, he was looking at the middle distance in the way a man looks when he is examining his own interior and finding it unexpectedly unfamiliar. He was bleeding from 4 separate places, and his left arm hung at an angle that suggested the forearm cut had done more than superficial damage, and he stood with all of this in the morning light, with the expression of a man who has just paid a price and is assessing whether the thing he purchased was worth it. Tyrion appeared at his side with the unobtrusiveness of a man who has spent a lifetime navigating spaces that were not built for him. "You'll need a maester," Tyrion said. "I've needed a maester before. This time you'll actually go to one." Tyrion looked up at him. "You understand that you cannot go back to Joffrey's service. Not today, possibly not ever, depending on how this sits with the Queen once she's had time to construct an interpretation." Sandor said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know. I have a suggestion, if you're open to one. You're going to make it whether I'm open to it or not." "That's accurate." Tyrion folded his hands behind his back. Lord Stark will need to leave this city as quickly as possible. The trial's outcome is legally binding. But legal and practical are two different languages in King's Landing. And Cersei's fluency is entirely in the practical. He'll need an escort north to a point where Robb Stark's forces can receive him safely. Someone capable, motivated, and currently without competing obligations. Sandor Clegane looked down at Tyrion Lannister with an expression that contained, somewhere in its complicated geography, something that might have been the ancestor of amusement. You're asking me to escort the man I just bled for through a city full of people who wanted him dead this morning. I'm suggesting it. There's a distinction. A long pause. In the yard, Ned Stark was speaking quietly with the High Septon. The crowd was beginning to disperse with the reluctant slowness of people who have witnessed something and are not yet ready to stop being in the presence of it. One condition, Sandor said. Name it, when we're clear of the city. He looked back at the yard, at the place where the maesters were working on Gregor Clegane. Tell me he's dead. Tyrion followed his gaze. The maesters' urgency had a specific quality that told a trained observer something about the probability distribution of outcomes. I'll find out, Tyrion said. It would be 3 days before Gregor Clegane died from the wound behind his gorget, attended by 2 maesters who would both later claim the wound had been more severe than it appeared and that there had been nothing to be done. Tyrion would always suspect at least one of them was lying, and would never be certain in which direction. He did not share this uncertainty with Sandor Clegane. Some truths were more useful delivered simply. Ned Stark left King's Landing on a moonless night 3 days after the trial, through a gate in the city's eastern wall that Tyrion had arranged to be, briefly and mysteriously, understaffed between the 2nd and 3rd hours past midnight. He left with Sansa, with 2 surviving members of his household, guard who had been held in a separate part of the dungeons and freed by a process Tyrion declined to explain in detail, and with Sandor Clegane, whose left arm had been stitched and wrapped by a maester who had asked no questions because Tyrion had paid him enough to buy the absence of questions outright. Arya was not there. This was the wound that did not close, the one that sat inside every other consideration and made the ordinary mathematics of survival feel obscene. She had disappeared into the city's chaos in the hours after Ned's arrest, and the search that Ned had conducted through intermediaries, through Tyrion's little birds, through a sellsword named Jax who owed a favor, through 2 gold cloaks, whose loyalty had been purchased at significant personal expense, had produced nothing conclusive. She was alive, or had been alive, or had been seen near the Street of Steel, or had not been seen anywhere. The city swallowed children within appetite that asked no permission and offered no receipts. Ned carried this the way he carried his leg, not without pain, but without allowing the pain to revise his decisions. Arya would survive or she would not, and his survival was the thing that gave him any ability to find her. A dead father was no help to a lost daughter. He had made himself believe this with the specific discipline of a man who has learned that some truths need to be enforced rather than felt. The road north began well and became complicated at Moat Cailin. Not complicated in the way of ambush, though they had anticipated that, and traveled by ways that added 2 days to the journey but reduced the likelihood of a convenient Lannister patrol finding them convenient. Complicated in the way of arriving at the gate of Robb Stark's northern passage point and discovering that the army encamped there had been waiting for news that was 3 days old and had built a great deal of anxiety around it. Robb came out of the command tent still buckling his sword belt, which meant someone had woken him, and he had not waited for the full ceremony of a warden's son receiving his father. He was 18, and he looked it in that moment. Not the young wolf of the armies stories, but a boy who had spent weeks being quietly, rigorously terrified and had not told anyone, and who now stood 10 feet from his father with an expression that could not decide what it wanted to be. Ned saved him the decision by closing the distance first. They did not speak for a long moment. The camp was quiet around them, the northern night cold and honest in the way that King's Landing's nights never were, smelling of pine and cook fires rather than the city's accumulated compromises. Cailin came out of the tent behind Robb with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes doing things that her face was trying not to show. And the reunion had the quality of something that had been denied its natural shape for so long that when it finally arrived, it could not quite believe in itself. Sandor Clegane stood at the camp's edge and watched with no expression and declined the offer of a fire. Later, when the family had been given the privacy the moment required and the camp had settled back into its nighttime rhythms, Robb Stark sat with his father in the command tent by the light of 3 candles and listened. He was good at listening, better than his age suggested, better than the young wolf stories accounted for, because the stories were about the boldness and the victories, and could not accommodate the quality of stillness that Ned recognized in his eldest son as something Cailin had given him. He listened to what had happened in King's Landing with the focused attention of a young lord, understanding that the story he was hearing was also a strategic briefing. When Ned finished, Robb was quiet for the length of time it takes a candle to burn a quarter inch. "The mountain is dead," he said. 3 days passed, and Sandor Clegane outside. "He'll need a decision from you about what comes next. He has no place to go back to." Robb looked at the tent wall, as if he could see through it too, where the hound was, standing at the camp's edge. "He fought for you. He fought for his own reasons. That doesn't make the blood he shed less real." Ned met his son's eyes. "I won't tell you what to do with him. You're the one commanding this army. But I will tell you that the man who stood in that yard against his brother, with no promise of land or gold or safety, is not a man whose service should be treated as cheap." Robb nodded slowly. "Then, the Lannisters won't accept this." "No. Cersei will find another way. Another charge, another instrument, another." "Yes." Ned's voice was level. "She will. But she'll do it from a position that is weaker than the one she held a week ago, in front of witnesses who watched the gods decline to confirm her narrative. That matters, even in King's Landing. Especially in King's Landing." He folded his hands on the table between them, the familiar gesture of a man settling into the part of the conversation that required precision. "What matters more is what we do next. And what we do next is the conversation I need to have with you. Because there are things you don't know that will change the shape of everything you think you're fighting about." Robb waited. The candles burned their quarter inch. Joffrey Baratheon is not Robert's son. The tent was very quiet. Outside, a horse shifted and stamped, and somewhere in the camp a man laughed briefly at something, and the night continued its business, with entire indifference to the information that had just changed the architecture of the War of the Five Kings. Robb's face moved through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, recalibration, the specific focused intensity of a young lord who has just had the ground under his political position fundamentally altered. He did not ask how Ned knew. He did not ask if Ned was certain. He had grown up as Ned Stark's son, which meant he had grown up understanding that when Ned Stark said he knew something, he knew it the way the North knows winter, without drama, without embellishment, as established fact. "Stannis," Robb said. "Stannis knows. He sent ravens before I was arrested. He's been building his case." Ned paused. "He's also been consulting with Melisandre, which introduces complications I would prefer to address before we decide how closely to align ourselves with his claim. He has the better legal right. He has the better legal right and the worst temperament. And in Westeros, those two things are not as separable as the law would prefer." Ned looked at his son. "I'm not telling you who to support. I'm telling you what I know, so that whatever you decide it with the full picture rather than the one the Lannisters were trying to paint." Robb absorbed this. Then, with the pragmatism that had won him 3 battles before his 19th year, Mother's been in contact with the phrase about the crossing, about a marriage alliance. Ned's expression shifted in a way that was subtle and complete. "Which crossing and what was offered?" "The twins. Walder Frey wants a Stark marriage. Either me or Arya. When she's found." Robb's jaw tightened at the last 3 words, the only indication of what those words cost him to say. Mother thought it necessary. The army needed the bridge. Ned was quiet for a long moment, turning the shape of it over, with the care of a man handling something fragile and double-edged. A Frey marriage had uses. It also had a quality of obligation that Walder Frey collected rather than honored, and the man's reputation for holding grudges across decades was not the reputation of someone whose alliance should be purchased on credit. Don't make the vow if you don't intend to keep it, Ned said. And if you make it, keep it regardless of what else presents itself. Walder Frey is not a man who forgets, and he is not a man who forgives. Make the promise with your eyes open, or don't make it at all. Robb nodded. He was writing something. On the inside of his expression, the specific serious notation of a young man. Incorporating a lesson he suspects he will need to remember in circumstances he cannot yet anticipate. Outside the tent, Sandor Clegane accepted a cup of something warm from a Stark soldier who had brought it, without being asked, and sat by the edge of a fire he had not requested, and stared into the middle distance of the northern night, with the expression of a man who has no idea what comes next and is, in a way he could not have predicted and would not have chosen, entirely at peace with this condition. Above the camp, the stars were the unsentimental northern stars, the ones that did not care about trials or politics or the debts that great houses owed each other, the ones that had been there before the Undulls crossed the sea and would be there after the last Stark and the last Lannister had finished their argument and gone to ground. They burned with the cold, clean indifference of things that have never been asked to choose sides. The ravens went out from Moat Cailin like a flock startled from a single tree, each carrying a different weight. One went to River Run, to Catelyn's father Hoster Tully, whose health was failing, and whose relevance to the war's politics had not failed with it. The Riverlands were the war's middle ground, the territory through which armies moved and burned and moved again. And Hoster's support meant access to ford and keep and harvest. One went to the Eyrie, to Lisa Tully, which Catelyn sent herself, and which she suspected would produce limited results because Lisa had been making decisions from inside her grief and her fear since Jon Arryn died, and grief and fear made poor strategic advisors. One went to Renly Baratheon at Highgarden because Renly had an army and a temperament that Robb assessed as potentially workable, and because Marjorie Tyrell's political intelligence was the sort of resource that wars were won or lost on access to. One went, at Ned Stark's specific and quiet insistence, to Dragonstone. Robb had raised an eyebrow at this. Catelyn had raised both. Ned had explained, with the patience of a man delivering a message. He has been composing for 14 years. That Stannis Baratheon's claim was the legitimate one, and that whatever they thought of the man's personality, building the northern case on the foundation of a legitimate claim was a significantly better architectural decision than building it on the foundation of a righteous grievance, however well-founded. Righteous grievances were plentiful in Westeros. Legitimate claims were rarer, and rarity had value. What he did not say, because the tent had too many ears even at midnight, was that the Raven to Dragonstone carried more than political overture. It carried the question that Stannis already knew the answer to, framed in language that invited Stannis to be the one to present the evidence publicly, which was a gift of strategic positioning that Ned offered with the specific generosity of a man who has learned that giving other people credit for the right idea is sometimes the most effective way to ensure the right idea survives. Stannis, who had been waiting years for someone to take his evidence seriously, received the Raven with the expression of a man who has been shouting into an empty room and has heard, for the first time, an echo. The response from King's Landing came not as a raven, but as a rumor, which was Cersei's preferred instrument when she needed to move without leaving fingerprints. The rumor was that Ned Stark's trial by combat had been tainted, that Sandor Clegane had acted not as a lawful champion, but as a traitor to his sworn oath, and that the Crown reserved the right to revisit the matter under cleaner procedural circumstances. This was legally incoherent, as Tyrion pointed out to anyone in the small council who would listen, which was fewer people than it should have been. Legal incoherence had never significantly impeded Cersei's agenda, and it did not impede it now. What the rumor accomplished was not legal, but atmospheric. It created the possibility, in the minds of lords who wanted to believe it because believing it was cheaper than opposing Lannister interests, that Ned Stark's innocence was contingent, that the gods' judgment was perhaps subject to appellate review by the Crown. It was a poisonous thing, carefully brewed, and it did its work in the city's corridors with the efficiency of a weapon, specifically designed for those corridors. Tyrion had expected it. He had prepared a counter-argument, in the form of a letter to the Citadel requesting a formal maester's review of the trial's procedural correctness, which he knew would take months and produce a conclusion that Cersei would ignore, but which would create a documented record that subsequent historians would find useful when writing about how the war began and who had been on which side of the law during its early architecture. He was thinking about subsequent historians with increasing frequency, which he recognized as a sign that the present had become too uncomfortable to inhabit without recourse to perspective. At Winterfell, Bran Stark dreamed. He had been dreaming since his fall. This was not news. The dreams had been with him through the whole of his recovery, vast and verdant, and full of a quality of sight that he could not describe to Maester Luwin because it had no adequate language in the ordinary vocabulary of what it meant to see things. He saw through the weirwood eyes. He understood this now with the certainty of a child who has accepted an impossible thing not because it is explicable, but because the alternative, believing his own perception, was false, was worse. He saw his father riding north toward Winterfell. He saw this 3 days before the Raven arrived, confirming it. And he sat with this knowledge in the godswood under the heart tree's blood-red gaze and felt the weight of it, not the weight of the information, but the weight of what the information meant about him, about the network of roots and sight that ran under all of Westeros, like a second nervous system, patient and ancient and completely indifferent to the political, whether on the surface. He also saw, in fragments and angles that the dreaming vision provided without context or narrative, something else. He saw the north, not the political, north of ravens and armies and the Stark name carved over keeps, the physical north, the north beyond the wall, the north that had no interest in the Game of Thrones and never had. He saw it the way the weirwood saw it, which was to say he saw it in the way of something very old, observing something inevitable, the white advancing, the dead moving, the silence that preceded the silence that preceded, the long night like the first cold hour, before a blizzard that will last a generation. He told Maester Luwin. Luwin listened with the careful, patient attention of a man whose entire intellectual tradition had spent the last 300 years systematically reclassifying magic from fact to metaphor, and who was now confronted with the specific, professional discomfort of watching the metaphors become literal. He wrote a cautious note in his personal journal, which he did not send anywhere because he did not yet know what to do with it. And he looked at the three-eyed raven that Bran described with the expression of a man whose category system is under renovation. That night, he wrote a second note, this one addressed to the Citadel, which he also did not send because it contained claims that would mark him as either prophetic or delusional, and he had not yet determined which designation was more professionally survivable. Robb Stark's War Council met for 6 days in the map room at Moat Cailin, and what emerged from it was not the straightforward southern campaign that the early Stark momentum had seemed to promise, but something more complicated and, Ned thought, more honest about the actual shape of the board. They would not march on King's Landing. Not yet. Not with Stannis building his own case in the east and Renly building his own army in the south and Tywin Lannister sitting at Harrenhal like a patient geological feature waiting for the other claimants to exhaust each other. To march on King's Landing now was to do Tywin's arithmetic for him, to spend Stark's strength against Lannister walls while the old lion watched and waited and made his move. When the spending was done, what they would do was consolidate, hold the north, strengthen the Riverlands alliance through the Tully connection, send envoys to Stannis. Ned would go himself, because Ned and Stannis had the specific respect of two men who found each other's company challenging, but whose mutual recognition of the other's integrity was genuine, an attempt to build a legal coalition around the succession question that would force the other lords to choose positions in public rather than maintaining the profitable ambiguity of watching from the side. It was, Ned knew, a slower strategy than righteous fury demanded and a more honest one than Westeros usually rewarded. He presented it to the council with the straightforwardness that had always made him a poor politician and occasionally a good one, not through manipulation, but through the specific power of a man who is saying exactly what he means in a room full of people who have forgotten what that sounds like. The council accepted it, with the exception of Greyjohn Umber, who accepted it loudly and with significant supplementary profanity, which Ned interpreted as a form of approval. That evening, Ned walked the camp's perimeter alone, which his guards permitted at a distance. After he pointed out that a man who had survived King's Landing's small council, the Lannister dungeons, and trial by combat against the mountains, Champion was probably capable of walking around a friendly camp without incident. The northern air was cold and real, pine and frost, and the specific honest smell of an army that believed in what it was doing, which was a different smell than an army that didn't. He stopped at the camp's northern edge and looked at the sky. The stars were the same stars he had looked at from Winterfell's battlements for 30 years. The same stars he had looked at from the Vale when he was young. The same stars that had been burning overhead the night he made promises in a tower in Dorne that he had been keeping quietly ever since. They did not offer counsel. They did not confirm strategy. They burned with the cold patience of things that had watched every war and every winter Westeros had ever known. From the north, carried on a wind that had no business being this far south in this season, came a cold that was not entirely explained by the calendar. Ned noticed it. He had grown up in the north. He knew what cold meant when it arrived ahead of schedule, carrying a quality of intention that weather did not normally possess. He stood in it for a long moment. The strategists, half of his mind still running through the War Council's conclusions, the northern half of his mind going very quiet in the specific way it went quiet when it was paying attention to something that mattered. Then he went back to his tent and told Robb in the morning that the war in the south was real and necessary, and entirely secondary to a conversation they needed to have about what was happening on the other side of the wall. Robb listened with the expression of a young lord being asked to hold two incompatible scales simultaneously and finding, to his own surprise, that the capacity was there. Stannis Baratheon received Ned Stark at Dragonstone in the way Stannis received everyone, without warmth, without ceremony beyond what protocol demanded, and with the particular quality of attention that distinguished Stannis from every other Lord Ned had dealt with in his adult life. Most lords listened to you while thinking about what they intended to say next. Stannis listened to you as though he were conducting an audit. They met in the chamber of the painted table. The ancient map of Westeros spread beneath them in carved and colored wood. The 7 kingdoms laid out with the unsentimental precision of a representation that predated the current arguments about who owned them. Dragonstone was cold in a way that was architectural. Rather than climatic, the castle had been built by Valyrian hands for Valyrian purposes and had never fully adjusted to the notion that it now housed people who had not come from the empire that had burned, and it expressed this adjustment difficulty through a persistent chill that no number of fires entirely addressed. Melisandre stood at the room's edge. She always stood at the room's edge, Ned noted, not seated among the advisors, not positioned as a servant, but occupying the precise spatial location of a person who considers themselves to be the most important element in any room they enter, but has learned the tactical value of not announcing this. She was watching him with the ruby at her throat catching the firelight, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has looked into flames and believes she has seen things there that justify any conclusion she has subsequently drawn. Ned had dealt with religious certainty before. He had dealt with it in the September of Baelor, in the Ares' peculiar devotions, in the Iron Islands' drowning priests. He had found, across decades, that certainty of any kind was most dangerous not when it was brutal. Brutal certainty was at least honest about itself, but when it was genuinely, helplessly convinced of its own benevolence. "You survived," Stannis said, by way of greeting. "I did. I did not expect you to." Stannis sat at the painted tables, head with the posture of a man whose spine had never learned to compromise. The Lannisters are not known for procedural precision when procedural precision inconveniences them. They are known for it when the inconvenience of ignoring it outweighs the inconvenience of compliance. Ned took the offered chair. Across the table, 10,000 witnesses in the September of Baelor is a great deal of inconvenience. To construct an alternative to, Stannis made a sound. That was the closest he came to acknowledging that something was worth a degree of satisfaction. You have the evidence about Joffrey's parentage. I have what I know. You have what Ser Jon Arryn discovered before he died, and what you've assembled since. Together it's sufficient. Ned looked at the painted table, at the carved coastlines, the painted mountains, the tiny representations of castles that contained actual people, making actual decisions that the map's neat geometry could not accommodate. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is how we present it in a way that forces the other lords to respond to it rather than ignore it. Lords ignore what they find inconvenient, Stannis said. Lords ignore what they can afford to ignore. Give them a price for ignoring it, and the calculus changes. Ned looked up from the table. Robb has halted the southern campaign. He's consolidating the north and the riverlands. He's not declaring a king. He's holding position and waiting for the succession question to resolve itself through legal channels before committing to a military campaign that benefits Tywin Lannister more than it benefits us. A pause. He needs you to be the legal channel. Stannis was quiet for a moment with the silence of a man who has spent years being told his claim was inconvenient and has not yet fully adjusted to being told it is useful. You're asking me to trust a boy's military strategy. I'm asking you to trust your own legal position, which doesn't require Robb's strategy to be brilliant, only for it to not be disastrous. The succession argument wins if it reaches the lords while they still have the option of choosing it. It loses if Tywin Lannister resolves the military situation first, because Tywin will install whatever king is most convenient and the law will be rewritten around the outcome. Ned met Stannis' eyes with the directness that Stannis, whatever his other qualities, had always respected. You have the right. I have the credibility. Robb has the army. None of those things are sufficient alone. Melisandre spoke from her position at the room's edge. The Lord of Light has shown me this moment, she said. Her voice had the quality of a woman who has decided that all human conversation is a prelude to the theological point she intends to make. Lord Stark burns in the flames, not in death, in purpose. R'hllor has marked him. Ned looked at her. With respect to your god, he said, I was marked by Catelyn Tully's father and the old gods of the north, and I found those obligations sufficient to be getting on with. Something moved in Melisandre's expression, not offense, precisely, but the specific recalibration of a woman who is accustomed to people either fearing her or believing her and is encountering a third category she finds professionally interesting. Stannis made a short sound that Ned realized, after a moment, was as close to a laugh as Stannis produced. She will tell you, he said, that the long night is coming, that the war for the Iron Throne is a distraction from the war for the living. He looked at Ned with the flat assessment of a man presenting a position he has had to live with for longer than he found comfortable. I believe she is correct. Ned was quiet. He had not expected that. I have been prosecuting the succession question because it is the right question legally. Stannis said, Robert's throne was taken by fraud, and the fraud should be corrected. That is the law, and I believe in the law. His hand moved across the painted table, touching the carved representation of the wall with a precision that Ned noted. But Melisandre has shown me things in the fire. I have seen, he stopped. Stannis Baratheon was not a man who said I have seen without the specific discomfort of someone describing something that conflicts with his rational architecture. I have sent ravens to the Night's Watch. Lord Commander, Mormont's responses have been more alarming than I expected from a man not given to alarm. I know, Ned said. Both Stannis and Melisandre looked at him. My son Bran has been dreaming through the Weirwood network since his fall. He has been seeing the north beyond the wall for months. Ned's voice was entirely level, the voice he used when he was saying things that he needed other people to hear clearly, without the distortion of his own reaction to them. The army of the dead is moving. It has been moving longer than the Night's Watch's reports indicate, because the Night's Watch has been reporting what its surviving members have seen, and survivors see the edges of things. He paused. Bran sees from above. He sees the center. The chamber of the painted table was very quiet. The fire in the great hearth burned without drama, indifferent to the weight of the conversation it was witnessing. Outside, the sea moved against. Dragonstone's volcanic rock with the persistence of something that does not understand. Why land believes it has a permanent right to its position. The succession question must be resolved, Ned continued. Not because it matters to the long night, it doesn't. The Night King does not distinguish between a Baratheon king and a Lannister puppet, but it matters because a fractured Westeros with 5 claimants exhausting each other's armies is a Westeros that faces the long night without a unified defensive structure. And a unified defensive structure is the only thing that gives us any margin at all. He looked at the wall's carved representation. We need the throne resolved so that the throne can be turned northward. Every month we spend fighting each other is a month the army of the dead spends walking south. Stannis looked at the painted table for a long time. His jaw worked with the specific motion of a man processing information that requires him to revise the structure of his priorities without abandoning any of the individual priorities themselves, which was architecturally complex. "What do you need from me?" he said. It was not a question. "A fleet," Ned said. "Your fleet, to move Robb's forces south along the coast when the time comes, bypassing Lannister-controlled roads. And your public statement, witnessed, sealed, presented to every lord still sitting on a fence, that the succession question is not about personal ambition, but about the survival of Westeros against a threat that respects no house words and bends no knee to any throne." He paused. "Lords who will not fight for Stannis. Baratheon's legal right will fight for the living against the dead. The cause is larger than the claimant. We need to make it that." Stannis was quiet for a long time. Melisandre looked into the fire with the expression of a woman seeing something she finds both confirming and more complicated than she had anticipated. Outside, a raven arrived on Dragonstone's rookery carrying Robb Stark's seal, and the message it carried was short, written in Robb's careful hand. And it said, "The Karstarks have joined us. The Manderleys have pledged ships. Lord Frey's ravens have gone quiet. I think he is reconsidering. Father, we have something to work with." The maester brought the message to the chamber's door and waited. Ned read it, and something in his face did what faces do when they receive news that confirms a direction without confirming an outcome, a loosening of one kind of tension and an immediate replacement with another. He handed it to Stannis. Stannis read it once, set it on the painted table over the carved image of the twins, and looked at Ned Stark with the expression of a man who has spent his life being right about things in ways that produced no warmth, and who is now confronted with the possibility that being right in company might feel different than being right alone. "The fleet," he said, "will be ready in a fortnight." From beyond the wall, carried on no wind that had any meteorological explanation, came a cold that passed through Dragonstone's volcanic stone as though the stone were gauze, and every fire in the castle guttered simultaneously. And for one suspended moment the chamber of the painted table was lit by nothing but the ruby at Melisandre's throat, burning red and certain in the sudden dark. Then the fires returned. No one spoke of it directly, but every person in that room had felt it, and every person in that room understood, with the specific clarity that physical sensation produces in the absence of any alternative interpretation, that the conversation they had just completed was not theoretical. The wall had been standing for 8,000 years, and in all that time it had never asked anyone's permission for anything. It rose from the landscape at the northern edge of the world with the absolute indifference of something that was simultaneously a physical object and a philosophical position. 300 miles of ice and ancient magic compressed into a structure that the maesters had spent centuries arguing about, and the people who actually lived near it had spent centuries not arguing about, because people who lived near the wall understood that some things were beyond the scope of argument. It was simply there, the way the cold was simply there, the way winter was simply there, a fact that preceded every human disagreement about what to do about it. Jon Snow stood at its summit on the morning that the first raven arrived from the south, and he read the letter with the expression of a man encountering something he had prepared himself to receive and discovering that preparation and reception are entirely different experiences. His father was alive. He read the sentence 3 times. which was 2 more times than were strictly necessary to understand it. And the third time he read it, the wall's wind took the edge of the parchment and tried to pull it from his hand, and he held on with a grip that had nothing to do with the letter's material, value, and everything to do with the specific human need to keep holding the physical object that carries news you are not yet ready to release. Ghost pressed against his leg without being summoned. Jon put one hand on the direwolf's head and looked north. The second raven arrived 2 days later, this one from Maester Luwin at Winterfell, and it contained Bran's account of the Weirwood dreams, transcribed in Luwin's precise hand with a note appended that said, in language that translated roughly from Maester's careful understatement into plain meaning as, I did not know what to do with this information and have decided the wall's command is the correct destination for it. Lord Commander Mormont read it, with the expression he had been wearing more frequently in recent months, the expression of a man whose professional assessment of the situation has been confirmed in ways that produce no satisfaction whatsoever. He called a senior officers' meeting in the King's Tower and presented the information with the directness that the Night's Watch, at its best, was built for. Sam Tarly took notes. Sam always took notes, which was why Jon had learned to make sure Sam was in the room when things mattered. The army of the dead, Mormont said, is no longer a patrol problem. He looked at the men assembled around the table, veteran rangers with the specific weathered quality of people who spend serious portions of their lives in serious cold, stewards who had heard enough ranger reports to know that the rangers were not men given to exaggeration, builders whose professional relationship with the wall had given them the specific intimacy of people who knew its sounds and its moods. It is an existential reckoning, and we are going to handle it with the resources we have, which are insufficient, and the warning we've given, which has been largely ignored, and whatever is now arriving from the south, which appears to be more than we have had reason to expect in some time. The something arriving from the south was Ned Stark, who rode through Castle Black's Gate 4 days later at the head of a column that contained Robb's advance riders, 200 Northern infantry, and Sandor Clegane, who had been traveling with the Stark party since Moat, Cailin, and had settled into the role of a man who has decided his next allegiance is to competence rather than house, and was conducting himself accordingly. The Night's Watch did not do formal receptions. Mormont met them in the yard with the handshake of a man who has been waiting for reinforcement long enough to have stopped expecting it, and was now recalibrating to a world in which it had arrived. Jon met his father at the gate. They were both men who had inherited the Stark difficulty with public displays of feeling, which was to say they stood for a moment looking at each other with all the things that needed to be said arranged between them like furniture in a room. Neither of them quite knew how to enter. And then Ned put his hand on Jon's shoulder, and Jon put his hand on Ned's arm. And the weight of the 14 years that Ned had carried the secret of Jon's parentage pressed against the inside of that moment with the specific urgency of something that had waited long enough. There are things I need to tell you, Ned said. Things I should have told you years ago. I know, Jon said. Ned looked at him. What do you know? I know what Bran sees. I know that the old gods speak through the Weirwood network to people willing to listen. Jon met his father's eyes with the steadiness of a young man who has spent a year at the wall, learning that the truth, whatever it costs, is cheaper than the alternative. And I know that you've been carrying something since before I was born, and that it's time to put it down. The wall's wind moved between them, cold and honest. Ned told him. He told him in the small room off the King's Tower where the fire burned adequately, if not warmly. And he told him with the directness that the moment required, Lyanna's name, Rhaegar's name, the tower in Dorne. The promise extracted at the cost of everything. The name that was not Jon Snow but was Jon Snow because it had been Jon Snow for 17 years, and the other name was a political instrument that required careful handling. He told him and watched Jon's face move through the geography of the information with the specific quality of a young man, discovering that the shape of his life is not what he had understood it to be, which is a discovery that no preparation adequately addresses. Ghost lay at Jon's feet throughout and did not move. When Ned finished, Jon was quiet for a long time. Aegon Targaryen, he said, not with ownership, with the careful pronunciation of someone trying on a name to see how it fits and finding it does not fit the way he expected, which is to say it fit more than he wanted and less than it demanded. You are also Jon Snow, Ned said. You have always been Jon Snow. What you do with the rest of it is a decision for another season. Right now, the Night's Watch needs rangers who can lead men beyond the wall, and that is the only identity that matters north of here. Jon looked at the fire. Then he looked at his father. Does Robb know? Not yet. He'll need to know. He will, when the time is right. Ned paused. The right time is not before the war is resolved. I have learned that. Releasing the right information at the wrong moment is indistinguishable from releasing the wrong information. Jon accepted this with a nod that contained the specific compressed patience of a young man who has decided to trust a judgment he does not entirely agree with. It was, Ned thought, the most stark thing he had ever done. The assault came on the seventh night. Not the full assault. That was still to come. The thing the dreams, and the ranger reports, and the guttering fires at Dragonstone were all pointing toward. This was the advance, the Night King's message, delivered in the language the army of the dead used exclusively. Cold and death and the blue light of whites moving through the dark in numbers that made the watches defensive. Arithmetic run out of room. Castle Black's horn blew 3 times. Jon Snow went over the wall with 40 rangers and came back with 31. And what they carried back with them was not victory. You did not have victories against the army of the dead in the way you had victories against armies of the living, but information. The specific, purchased in blood information of how the advance elements moved, what they responded to, where the dragon glass worked and where it worked imperfectly, and most critically, what the Night King's presence at the advances edge meant about the timeline between this and the full assault. Ned Stark stood on the walls, summit in the aftermath, and watched the northern dark with the expression of a man who has organized wars and trials and political crises, and is now looking at something that makes every previous item on that list feel like preparation, rather than experience. Sandor Clegane stood beside him without comment. The dragonglass supply from Dragonstone was 3 weeks out. Stannis had kept his word, his fleet already moving. Robb's main force was marching north. Sam had found something in the Castle Black library, a Valyrian steel footnote in a maester's account of the last long night, that he was working through, with the focused intensity of a man who suspects he is reading something important and cannot yet confirm what it means. It's bigger than the trial, Sandor said. Not asking, observing. It was always bigger than the trial, Ned said. The trial was a door. This is what was on the other side of it. Sandor absorbed this with the silence that had replaced his more aggressive register sense. Moat Cailin, not softened, but recalibrated towards something that was less contempt and more assessment. He looked north. What do we do? He asked. It was a genuine question, unarmored by irony, which from Sandor Clegane was the equivalent of another man going to his knees. Ned looked at the stars. Above the wall, the cold northern stars. That Bran saw through the weirwood eyes. That Jon had grown up under, that the Night's Watch had been watching for 8,000 years. He thought of the painted table at Dragonstone, of Stannis' careful logic, of Robb's dispatches, of Sam's careful notes, of the letter still in his pocket from Cailin that said simply, "Come home when you can. The children need their father, and I have been afraid long enough." He thought of Arya, somewhere in a city or a road or a life he could not yet see, carrying a sword too large for her and a list he hoped stayed short. "We hold the wall," Ned Stark said. "We send the ravens. We wait for the living to remember that the only war that has ever mattered is the one they keep forgetting about." He turned from the northern dark. "And we do not lose." Sandor Clegane looked at him with the expression he had been building towards since a cell in King's Landing, since a fighting square before the September of Baelor, since a road north through a country that had spent 20 years trying to grind the honor out of its people and had not entirely succeeded. It was not admiration. It was something that operated in the same territory as admiration without requiring the softness admiration usually demanded. He turned back to the northern dark. "Right," he said. The wall stood behind them. 8,000 years of ice and magic and human stubbornness. And below it the army of the dead, regrouped in the dark with the patience of things. that do not experience time as a cost. And above it the stars burned with the cold indifference of the very old. And on its summit 2 men who had arrived at this moment by entirely different roads stood in the wind and watched the north and held the line. The ravens were already flying south. Ned Stark had invoked 7 words in the September of Baelor, and those 7 words had not saved Westeros. Nothing so simple saves Westeros. What they had done was purchase time. Time for Robb to hold rather than overextend. Time for Stannis to be heard rather than ignored. Time for Jon Snow to learn what he was before the world demanded he use it. Time for the living to remember what they were living against. The Mountain was dead. The Lannister machine continued without him, because machines do not require any single component. And Cersei Lannister was too intelligent and too ruthless to be undone by a single trial's outcome. The game continued. It always continued. But north of all that, the wall held. And on its summit the Warden of the North stood with the Hound at his shoulder and his son below him and his family moving toward him from the south. And the ravens carried the truth outward to every lord still capable of hearing it. The long night was coming. It had always been coming. What was different now was that someone was ready. The army of the dead would face a Westeros that had not entirely consumed itself. A wall still manned by men who knew what they were defending. And a Stark still alive to hold the pieces together through the cold. Winter was coming.